Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, finally, I'm talking about the debut album from the Prodigy, Experience. Alright, it's finally time to get into the next discography review, and boy, if this isn't one of the most frequently requested bands or artists that people have asked me to do a series on over all these years. Given my obvious long-standing love for 90s UK techno and rave music, and having already done substantial coverage of bands like Orbital and 808 State and the Chemical Brothers among many others, it was only inevitable that someday I'd do a series on this other set of big, obvious 90s rave pioneers. Not to mention, with me having just finished a slightly exhausting and overlong series on the work of Tangerine Dream, I felt like, to balance things out, I needed to cover a shorter and more manageable catalog which could bring some much higher energy material as a direct contrast to TD's more ambient tendencies. And hey, I've already reviewed the Prodigy's last two studio albums, so that should make this a relatively quick series to get through. Now's as good a time as any to finally get around to talking about them. I can't imagine anyone needs an introduction to this English four-piece outfit, or at least it was a four-piece outfit at the time. Led by producer Liam Howlett, alongside rapper Maxim Reality, and two dancers in Keith Flint and Leroy Thornhill, who at this point weren't contributing anything on a musical level. The band has always kind of been something of a Liam Howlett solo project at its core since the beginning, with him doing 99% of the work for this album. Back when I reviewed their most recent album, No Tourists, I made the joke that the band lineup consisted of Liam Howlett, Keith Flint, Maxim, and Liam Howlett. It didn't seem like the fans appreciated that one all too much. Anyway, Howlett started out as a hip-hop DJ as a teenager in the late 80s in a short-lived band called Cut to Kill, but quickly afterwards pivoted to the ongoing rave scene, making his own music. He met Flint and Thornhill while doing a gig in his hometown of Braintree, Essex. Flint asked him to make a mixtape of those demos he'd been working on, which Howlett scratched the name Prodigy on, named after the Moog Prodigy synth he made some of his music with. Flint and Thornhill really liked the tape while using it to come up with their new dance sequences and decided, hey, how about they form a band? Howlett agreed, and thus the Prodigy was born in 1990. Also, before their debut gig, they met an MC called Maxim Reality, who they also invited on board and showed up to that first gig to improvise some lyrics on stage. With the band all together, they were now set to start officially releasing music. Howlett shopped around record labels before eventually finding one that would sign them in XL Recordings, and in 1991 they released their debut promotional EP that would really break them out, called What Evil Lurks. And when I say it would break them out, I just mean in the underground. And the EP may be considered a classic now, and it is really solid. It's worth checking out, but it didn't actually chart at the time, as far as I can tell. It may have a neat techno-flavored track called Android, which was starting to make waves in their scene, as well as some other track called Everybody in the Place, which I guess people liked or something, but wasn't as notable. And while they were doing gigs and touring these tracks, Howlett threw together some random, half-baked novelty track that sampled some old, well-known British safety PSAs for children from the 70s called Charly Says, where, an animation of some little kid who owns a cat called Charlie talks to you about telling your mom where you're going before you go out somewhere. Turned that into a rave track, sure, why not? That track was obviously called Charly, spelled a little different from the PSAs, and it absolutely blew the fuck up. Nearly overnight. Went all the way to number 3 on the UK singles charts. That track was somewhat controversial at the time, with some finding a hardcore breakbeat track sampling a children's PSA to be a cool, clever, out-of-the-box idea, and others finding the idea to be corny and annoying. But the commercial success was undeniable, and they were starting to see a mainstream-adjacent level of attention, at least in their home country, and it translated to all their other subsequent singles at the time also charting in the UK. Including a new Fairground remix of Everybody in the Place, which was even more successful, and only kept from becoming a #1 hit because it released around the same time Freddie Mercury died, and thus Bohemian Rhapsody outcharted it. So with all this wild success, the label floated the suggestion to Howlett that, how about the band put together a debut album? And Howlett was like, hell yeah, let's try it. Initially, he wanted to make a Pink Floyd-inspired concept album out of their trademark rave music, but found trying to fit everything into the framework of an overarching concept too limiting for him, and thus the album became more of a vehicle for him to just do whatever the hell he felt like within their specific rave style, as well as repackage all their popular singles and a bunch of their B-sides as well. However, despite more than half the tracks on this album being released as either singles or B-sides, very few of them appear completely unchanged from their original single versions. Nearly all of them have been rearranged and remixed in some way for the album. Now, you obviously don't need me to tell you that Experience is an absolute classic. You probably already knew that before you clicked on this video. Maybe you've been following this channel for a long enough time where you remember my 2016 favorites of all time list, where I included this album at the number 46 spot. So, it won't surprise anyone to hear that I've always loved this album from the first time I heard it, and I've always considered it one of the best and most viscerally hard-hitting collections of dance music around. Nobody needs me to tell them that this album basically set down the blueprint for 90s breakbeat, which is still copied from to this day, and finished the job that Orbital's Green Album and 808 State's 90s started of capturing the essence of what that 90s UK rave movement was all about, and really froze that moment in time in such an easy-to-digest way that instantly demonstrates the appeal of why this scene was such a big deal in the first place. Fellow 90s rave legend Moby has gone on record marking this album as a big inspiration on him in his early days. How he thought dance albums on the scene usually didn't work over the course of the whole album and were often no more than singles compilations, but Experience changed his perception of how these kinds of albums could work through its wide variety of styles and how everything came together in a full, holistic experience true to the album's title. While I don't know if I agree with Moby's point about, the wide variety of styles looking at it in retrospect, there's definitely albums from the time that were a lot more stylistically varied than this. And it does also still have a little bit of the feeling of a singles compilation to me on top of that. But I do agree on the point of how it comes together as a complete whole. Not because it's taking you on through, a lot of radically different ideas, but simply because every single individual track on it is great. There's a clear formula underpinning the whole project of tracks, building themselves out of those classic 90s breakbeats and various sample mashups. But Howlett just had such an ear for catchy hooks, and making each of these samples he includes just unfixably stick in your brain and stay there. Whether those tracks be made out of samples from reggae tunes, sped up and chipmunked rappers, house pianos, R&B singers, above-mentioned children's PSAs, or Arthur Brown screaming about how he's the god of hellfire. Whatever Howlett just happened to grab in a given moment, it's going to be turned into an earworm hook and layered over one of the heaviest and most hard-hitting sets of classic 90s breakbeats you've ever heard. And the quality and easy memorability of the hooks alone prevents the album from ever feeling like it has any redundancy. Also, having perused through a lot of those alternate versions of these tracks from the singles by some people's request, with only a couple of exceptions, the versions that actually made the album are also the best versions in my opinion. I'll talk about other versions of tracks where applicable. Now, the album starts with Jericho, one of the tracks which was released as a single 2 weeks before the album but left unchanged here. And it's as great a tone setter as anything else here, pretty much just lets you know exactly the kind of experience you're about to get, with a little bit of everything from the album brought together, I guess. Sampled hooks about the walls of Jericho, or shouting, keep on dancing, chaotic rave stabs and unstable house pianos, bubbling acid-flavored bass, and an incomprehensible pitched-up rapper in the background. Little interjections of, feel the bass come down on me. Samples of the guy from AC/DC screaming used as a fill before the beats drop. Maybe even some air raid sirens or something. This track is total unhinged chaos, but it all comes in service of the visceral danceability, and the core groove provided by the crashing breakbeats ties all of these weird, disparate elements together in a way that feels totally natural. I don't know if anyone can listen to a track like this, or anything else on this album for that matter, without being compelled to move your body along with the beat. Just instantly gets you and everyone else in the room energized. And from there, the next several tracks basically capture the same sort of vibe while all segueing each idea together without any pauses, just like any good DJ set would. Music Reach 1, 2, 3, 4 just picks up right from where Jericho left off with a near seamless transition in the exact same sort of vibe, definitely building itself more around the chaotic synth pads which get really intense and drill-like, but also coming complete with some big soulful R&B vocals care of guest vocalist Simone kind of wailing in the background, bright bell sound effects and more pitched up samples talking about make me wanna jump, or the one sample of someone counting which sounds like they could have inspired the screaming sound effects from Monkey Ball nearly a decade before that game even came out. Next up we got Wind It Up, which currently appears to have been taken off the album on streaming services for whatever reason. I'm guessing some sample-related copyright dispute. But this track is even better than the last two and has the brightest and most uplifting melodies yet, with its cheery house pianos and synth pads going up next to the reggae samples of "People like some justice in this life" and some other snippet from an R&B singer, while the breakbeats continue to go as hard as they always do. There's also an alternate version of this track which was released as a single after the album called Wind It Up Rewound that rearranges a bunch of the various ingredients that went into this track and pitches the sampling the title up much further into chipmunk range. I don't like that version as much as the original, but, you know, it's a thing that exists if you're interested, and some people do prefer that version. Though speaking of remixes, next we got Your Love Remix, which, as you would guess, is a rearranged version of the track which was originally a B-side on the Charly single. And incidentally, this is one of the few examples where I personally prefer the original single version over the album version, for the simple reason that the original was the first track I ever heard by the Prodigy, thanks to finding it in an iTunes Essentials playlist. It's their most classic deep house flavored tune, with the MIDI pianos going up next to sparse rave stabs and repeating "Go Now" samples and acid bass and whooping and whistling and whatnot. One of the smoothest and most melodic tracks in their repertoire, but still capturing that high-energy party atmosphere. I only slightly prefer the original for nostalgia reasons, and the fact that I'd been bumping it for at least a year before I got to hear Experience in its entirety. The remixed album version, it doesn't improve upon it, but neither does it take away from anything about the track that initially made it great. It just, you know, like, slightly changes the chord progression of the pianos, speeds up the tempo a little bit, rearranges various elements again, and adds in some new, incomprehensible, sorta counting samples. Yibbidum-running. This version definitely fits much better for the way the album flows as a whole, and segues better into its surrounding tracks, even if I think the original is a little better as a standalone track. Next up we got Hyperspeed G-Force Part 2. I think this is the first track that I'm not sure if I would include among the biggest highlights, but it's still a great track for sure. Like, it gets a bit more repetitive in one note than the previous tracks, and that pitched up hook about cruising at hyperspeed. That can be a bit annoying if I'm not in the right mood, but it still has just as hard-hitting breakbeats as all the other tracks here, and the way the synth pads and stabbing bass lines build around it is still more than epic enough for the track to work. If this technically isn't a favorite, that lets you know just how damn consistent the album is. I did hear the track which this acts as a sequel to for the first time while researching this video, G-Force Part 1 Energy Flow, I think from the Everybody in the Place single. And I think that track is also better than its companion on the album. The bass is just so epic and overpowering in the best way, and the crashing techno drum machine beats are like a different flavor that contrasts more with the break beats that the album proper focuses on, and goes hard in a very different but equally satisfying way. Though Hyperspeed is also catchier. Anyway, next we get Charly, Trip in the drum and bass version, a new remix of the track that first really blew them up. Now, as historically important as the original single version of this track is, I'm admittedly not as big a fan of it as you'd think. It's certainly a fun time, but like the fake meowing and the kid talking kind of make for more of like a quirky but shallow novelty than an actually strong hook to base a track like this around. It probably hit better back when the track first released, like if you were British and already saw those PSAs in between other programs and thus found it funny that that thing you recognized was being repurposed in this way. Or maybe I got that, maybe I don't perceive that right, but I'm American, and as someone who only ever heard of those PSAs because of this song, it's kind of weak and oddly forgettable as a hook. And if I'm not in the right mood, the meowing can sound more like someone's vomiting in falsetto and get on my nerves. This album version may not change too much besides raising the tempo again and adding in a new sample about a little bit of bass, little bit of bounce. But it's just through the addition of that one new sample that gets this track to work a lot better, because now that can operate as a proper hook. Now the meowing and kid talking is just adding some goofy and playful flavor on the side while also being bounced off the new hook in a clever way. Charly says bass, Charly says bounce. This version of the track feels like it has more of a defined backbone to it and is thus now able to hit on the same high level for me as most of the other tracks here. But as big a classic as that track is, the first track that is always going to come to mind whenever I think about this album in passing has to be the next one, Out of Space. I fucking love Out of Space, and I have to question anyone to whom this track is unable to get them to crack a smile in any way. It's the best track on the album in my opinion, and might just be my favorite track by the Prodigy overall. It's no less goofy and cartoonish as Charly, if not even a fair bit more so. Like, there's even fucking cartoon boinging sound effects all over it. But man, the hooks, the build-ups, and payoffs, it's just A+ perfect all around. The way it starts out, almost subtle with those synth pads in the beginning, but then chops up all those bell sound effects with the break beats coming in to kick things into high gear again, just providing that perfect layup for that goofy-ass reggae hook to come in. I'm gonna send into outer space, find another race. Beep! Just sticks in the head so easily, and the way that leads into the perfect drops of more heavy breakbeats and chaotic buzzing rave stabs. And they add in more chipmunk rap samples as an equally catchy hook. I take your brain to another dimension! Pay close attention! As if the other hook wasn't enough, just every element is so perfectly placed to maximize the possible excitement level. A track that otherwise sounds like such a joke hitting so damn hard it can be taken seriously. It's just so damn good I don't know what to say. And right after that, we got a new version of their highest charting hit from this era, Everybody in the Place 155 and Rising. Pretty much the same upgrade that Charly received for its trip into drum and bass version, in that it's rearranging and chopping up elements from the original in a newer, higher BPM mix with some extra samples thrown in, namely a glitched up voice saying peace. Although this 155 and Rising version isn't necessarily any better or worse than the Fairground mix that was the actual hit. It's building off an already solid template by chopping up those already solid carnival-esque chiming synth melodies and samples yelling the title and reconfiguring them into something that pretty much hits with the same effect. I think I might prefer the album version slightly, though much like with Your Love, that preference really only comes from me knowing the album version longer and only hearing the other versions for the first time while researching this video. So thus far in the album, we've gotten nothing but non-stop bangers back to back to back. There hasn't been a single moment where the momentum has slowed down even a little bit since the moment you first hit play on Jericho. But at this point in the album, Hell It is nice enough to provide something of a comparative breather in weather experience. It's the longest track on the album at over 8 minutes, and there's a surprising amount of that time being taken up by sparser ambience, be it melodic pads, squirting effects, or menacing bass, without any beats to accompany it. Mind you, it's not such a drop in energy to feel out of place on the album. A lot of the track is taken up by some slower breakbeat workouts that almost have a little bit of like an abstract hip-hop flavor maybe. And around the halfway mark, the track switches gears with a classic TB303 acid line and the beat work returning to the same frantic high tempo that the rest of the album operates on. It can still bang in a pinch, and is still meant to feel big and epic, but, you know, in a very different way from anything else on this album. Probably won't surprise anyone familiar with my tastes to hear that this has always been a consistent favorite moment on the album for me. Can always appreciate a breather like this, especially one that operates on this comparatively more epic scale. Even if on some recent listens the sudden slowdown of momentum could feel a bit disconnected from the rest of the album and throw me off a little bit. But then we reach the last leg of the album where the momentum just picks right back up as if Weather Experience didn't even happen, and we get another one of the big singles in Fire Sunrise version. It's another classic banger that hits on all the same notes as all the other bangers here. Obviously, the Arthur Brown sample is the element that sticks out the most by far. I heard this track long before hearing the original Arthur Brown track and always thought his yelling was like the coolest and most memorably aggressive shit. I am the god of hellfire and I bring you fire. But the way all the other samples bounce off each other, like the whooping and whistling or that chipmunk reggae voice that gets chopped up a bit and go up against the syncopated clanking synths, creates a pretty strong and uplifting vibe that fits for the Sunrise subtitle. The single version of this track, also known as the Burning version, is a bit grittier, not quite as cheery. Which version you prefer is up to taste, I suppose, and much like Everybody in the Place, I think I'd gravitate towards the album version out of greater familiarity and nostalgia. Next up, Rough in the Jungle Business. Well, I don't know if this track's ever been a huge favorite, since there's been times when the almost robot voice hook saying part of the title got a bit too well lodged in my head for its own good, and might have gotten grating. It has grown on me while re-listening to it for this video, still hits really hard, features a lot of really epic and driving synth pads, and a few smoother R&B vocal interjections from Simone returning. Feel the jungle vibe, baby. Still a great track all around. And kind of similar feelings on the closer, Death of the Prodigy Dancers. This always used to be my default pick for least favorite on the album because it always felt like such an arbitrary and borderline unsatisfying sequencing choice for the album to end here, and it doesn't really have much of a hook to begin with, or any melody for that matter. But I've actually come around quite a bit on this track as well the more I've re-listened to it for this video. It's the only track on the album to feature contributions from a full-time band member who isn't Liam Howlett. Maxim Reality comes in to improvise some lyrics about "let it rock ya, let it move ya," and "how to kill the Prodigy dancer." There's an extra reason for this not to have been the album I covered as a tribute back when Keith Flint died. But anyway, Maxim is putting so much oomph and energy into his voice over some of the hardest hitting and crashing beat work on the whole album, and lots of squirting 90s acid bass. Also, since this track was recorded live, you can very subtly hear the reverb of the room they're playing in, which is, like, clearly really small and stuffy and likely has a lot of people crammed in to dance. Really immerses you in that stuffy warehouse rave atmosphere while going hard to a level that seems to hint at the direction the band would start to progressively move in after this album. Almost feels like an ominous 808 State Bandit Check-like way for this project to finish, and I think at this point I have just talked myself out of having a least favorite on this album at all. I pretty much enjoy all these tracks on a comparable enough level where I don't really want to pick one. Every single track feels like a big classic and they all fit together so damn well. But yeah, I think that's about all I have to say on Experience. I don't really feel like going through all the other B-sides I haven't mentioned, like We Are the Roughest or Pandemonium, but, you know, those exist if you want to seek them out among others. And if you just wanted an introduction into what made this early incarnation of the Prodigy so important, I mean, this album is the best possible place to start. Also a great place to start if you were looking for an album that really demonstrates what made that whole 90s rave era so great and why so many people still try to recapture its success to this day. I won't say it's absolutely perfect. I will admit that in the lead up to this video, I did end up listening to this album enough times where I ended up getting kinda sick of it and realizing there was a clear upper bound to how much I could get out of it. One could easily argue that all the pitched up chipmunk samples and hooks could get annoying really fast and start to become catchy in the bad way. If that's your stance, I would definitely understand. And that may have also been the element of this album that most wore out on me as well, with the more time I spent with it. If you've listened to as much 90s flavored dance music as I have, especially coming out in the last few years, it's possible this may have even lost a little bit of its initial charm and flavor. But at the same time, when I'm in the right mood for it, this can hit on an absolutely transcendental level. My first return listen came right after I finished that 2.5-hour Tangerine Dream odds and ends video, and I'd been listening to so much aimless 80s synth background music that hearing the Prodigy was exactly the palate cleanser I needed. I put it on while I was walking home from visiting my grandmother, and I was almost like breaking out into a sprint from how hard some of these tracks go. And even after I've listened to it too many times, the tracks at the end that I used to be not as hot on started growing back on me, so that seems like a good sign too. But yeah, I don't really know what else to say. Regardless of any mood-related ups and downs I might have with it, Experience is obviously an undeniable all-time classic, and I cannot score it any lower than a solid 9 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.